In the class that I teach for the nurses, we talk about the Christian narrative. But we can also talk about the biblical narrative, right? That the whole of the Bible, from the Hebrew scriptures through to the Christian scriptures, it doesn't follow a continuous narrative line, but there is a story that is being told. A story in the best sense of the word that carries all of the weight of the spirituality and the unveiling of the story of how a people chosen by God managed to chart their course through life, facing all kinds of struggles and difficulties. It's a real life story even for us today. But the beginning of this narrative, the biblical narrative, while not the first story written, the first chapter of Genesis, tells us that in the beginning God creates from nothingness. But in that, God calls into the midst of chaos and calls forth each of the aspects of creation: life, light, animals, plants, culminating in the human person at the end, where the male and female, the human persons, are made in the divine image and likeness. A much older story is told in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. It's older probably by 500, 600, 700 years. So it's much earlier in the life narrative of the people of Israel. And there it's clear that as God creates the human person, and how it's understood that we give this first person the name Adam, but it actually means the dust creature or the earth creature. So really no gender is attached at that point. But in any event, God creates from the dust, from the earth, this living being, and gives it the name Adama, the earth creature. In this, God presents all of the animals, all the creation to the earth creature, but the text says none of them proved to be, quote, a suitable companion for the earth creature. I remember in explaining this one point, I incensed a few dog and cat lovers in the audience when I said that no dog or cat can really be a good companion. And even though my little doggy, Sandy, is a good companion, you'll see how this works, all right? So don't get angry at me about if you're dog or cat lovers, right? So in that, God enters into a second act of creation, and to appease all the feminists in the group, that this is the culmination of creation, that the woman is the pinnacle of creation. Because in this, as the text suggests, that when this second creature is made, God brings that second creature to the first creature, and the text says this: at last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That there's a recognition that in the other person who looks like the first creature, that there is now a relationship that defines who I am in relation to the other, and it's only in that relationship to the other that we know who we are as humans. That's why dogs and cats can't do that, although some people might want to be like dogs or be like cats, but they can't be. They're not like us in terms of all of what we understand our humanity to be. I start there because at the foundation of this narrative is the understanding that the human creatures, the earth creatures, the male and female, that we are only who we are when we are in relationship with other earth creatures. We have to rule out any thought that I can be who I am quite independently, independent from and free from anybody. I don't need anybody to be who I am. And that's really a false story, a false narrative. It leads to, in the United States, this rugged individualism that we can do anything, be anything, and nobody else contributes to that. And that is a false narrative, because it's only when we are in relationship with each other, only when we recognize ourselves in another that we are who we are. And only then, in relationship with each other, can we achieve the fullness of our own particular humanity. In other words, we can't be human without relationship. And we can't be humans without the community of that relationship. So that's at the foundation and the core of this whole narrative. And in a sense, it really is the foundation of humanity on earth. I mean, if you look at the story, at all of the various creation stories, that all of those various creation stories always include a component of the establishment of relationship between the human creatures and the creation of community. That's what communal relationship is, the establishment of community. That suggests, if you look at all of the stories, again suggests that this is foundational to who we are as human beings. It's interesting in this story, and while I don't often read from the Old Testament, our Hebrew scripture, I thought it was important, especially because if you know, coming up this Friday is Rosh Hashanah, which is the celebration of the new year in the Jewish community, followed by 10 days of awe and wonder, leading to perhaps, at least in contemporary Judaism, the most important day, Yom Kippur, when there is a reflection on the brokenness of relationship and the brokenness of community, and the prayer to God to heal and make whole again what has been broken. So to tell this story, it sounds in this text that it really is Passover that is the key. And the reason I think why at this point, at least in the narrative, why Passover is the key is because if you look at the larger context of this story, it's hinted at, right, that the angel of death is going to pass over the Egyptians, and only because the the doorposts of the homes of the Israelites are marked with the blood from the sacrificed lamb will the angel of death pass over them. It speaks to the fact that when we are struggling to find relationship and establish relationship and remain in relationship and create the community of relationships around it, that it happens within perhaps a larger context of struggle, of death, of fear, of anxiety. We know the story of Israel, that it's happening in the context of oppression and slavery, where the assault on human dignity and the assault on human life is happening every day that the story gets told. So here we are trying to understand that relationships are key and community of relationships is foundational, but also to understand that around that is all of this craziness of the world of oppression and slavery and fear and anger and death and destruction and all that kind of stuff going around it. But what I want you to hear in the text, importantly, is that, again, this is not something that individual Israelites have to think they face alone. That it's clear from the text that they are to gather together, assemble together into one congregation, if you will, and that only, it's like strength in numbers, that we can't face this reality of trying to maintain relationships in the midst of all of this craziness of the world by ourselves, that we have to face it in numbers, that the greater the numbers, the more opportunity there is for us to deal with the world and to maintain relationships in the community. The whole assembly. And notice it says at the beginning of the month. In other words, that this whole event gives them an identity that maybe they didn't have before as a people. The narrative before this is individual families, Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, that this is an individual story. But Exodus, the story of Passover and Exodus, transformed the individual story into a communal story. This is our story. not my story, it's our story. And so we tell this story, and it's interesting, if you know anything about the Passover, that the youngest child, meaning this is not an adult celebration, it's a family celebration. In fact, Passover generally doesn't happen in a synagogue. It happens in the home, where you invite others to come into your home and to share. And interesting, isn't it, that it happens at a communal meal. It doesn't happen at Wendy's. It happens in the home at a meal that is well prepared and that everybody comes together to do it. And the question that the youngest asked that night is, what's different about this night than all the other nights of our lives? And the elder of the house says, it's different because on this night, we cried out to God, and God heard our cries and began the process of liberation. We were once slaves in Egypt. We are no longer slaves. And the whole idea is that on that night, generations later till now, that when they celebrate Passover, it's as if we were once again back there. So that a part of the community, the communal relationships and the work of relationship brings us into association with, brings us into a sense that their story is as much as our story. And that through the generations we tell it in such a way that it's meant to then enable us to be stronger in who we are today because of all the stuff that they had to go through and all the struggle that they had before us. That we're stronger now because of what they did and what they faced and how they did it and how they managed and the ups and downs and the twists and turns and all of that. That today we are stronger because of that. And by retelling the story empowers us to then continue to be committed to relationships and communal and a community of relationships, and continues to enable us, empowers us, if you will, to be witnesses to how this is all working. And what I want you to hear in that is, you see, the story is clear, and that whole section of Exodus is very clear, that God doesn't stand outside of that, but stands in the midst of. That God is in the midst of it. The text that says, I have heard your cries, I know what you're suffering, I have seen your affliction, and therefore I am now working for your liberation. That God is clearly in the midst of that. So it might be that the glue, if you will, I don't know if that's another word for God, the glue, but it could be, right? That God is the glue that binds together the relationships and the communal relationship, binds it together in such a way that, again, it's not frayed around the edges, but stuck together in the shared memory of all of this. And in the shared memory of all of this, we can't at some point along the way say, nah, that's not my story anymore. It always is your story. Ask any secularized Jew, right? When it comes to these feast days, they're as Jewish as the CNA. We always used to say in the Catholic Church, the CNA Catholics, right? The Christmas and Easter Catholics, or the Christians that show up only on. It doesn't matter. There's a shared story that even if you don't go to church anymore and don't claim religion anymore, there's a shared story that you are a part of it, whether you like it or not, because that's what it means to be in relationship and in the community of relationships. That's what it means. You can't absent yourself from humanity. I suppose you could. But I always find it interesting. I don't know why I thought about this now, but it's interesting in so many of the science fiction things when they go and they discover life on another planet. Well, they just look like humans. Now, I don't know if that's the Hollywood's view of things, but it's very interesting, isn't it? Why? Because again, we come to know, and if you follow those stories, we come to know who we are when we are encountering other human beings in different cultures, in different languages, in different religions, and so forth. And it always, every time that I've taken a trip to another place, I always come back stronger in who I am, stronger in my beliefs, stronger in my understanding of the great diversity of humanity. But I tell you all of that because somewhere along the way, as the narrative unfolds, it's very clear that whether it's individuals or individual moments in time in the life of ancient Israel and Christianity for that matter, that there are choices that are made that put the priority no longer on relationships or the community of relationships, but choices that are made for the advancement of individual power, individual control, individual desires and wishes, over and against the community of relationships. And so this is describing, if you go back to the third chapter of Genesis, it's clear that in that dialogue between the serpent and the first creatures, it's clear that the question is raised. Did God really intend you to be in relationship with each other and in creation? Well, surely not. God rather doesn't want you to eat of that fruit because your eyes will be opened and you will see how unfair God is, how untrue the story of God is, how unrealistic it is to think that you can be only about relationships and communal relationships. And so I just love the phrase, that they see the fruit and it goes, oh, it looks so good. It was so delicious. It was so desirous. They could just taste it already in their mouth. And you see the false narrative that presents is, I don't need anybody to be who I am. In fact, what happens is that we talk about that story as the origins of sin. Most likely it's not. But in any event, it tells us that relationships, and we know this, relationships and communal relationships are very fragile. And they're fragile to the point where at any moment we can choose to think that I'm better than this community, or I'm better than my partner or my spouse. That we can choose at some point to break the connection, and in breaking the connection of relationships, manage to think again that the whole world revolves around us and that we represent the whole. You see, the narrative in the scripture tells us we never represent the whole unto ourselves. We only represent the whole when we are in relationship with each other. When we are in relationship maybe with a particular person or in relationship with the community. That's only when we're whole. So the story, as it unfolds, recounts moments in Israel's life when those choices and decisions break down the relationships of the community and break down individual relationships. To the point where, you know how the story goes, right? Israel is overrun by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, by the Persians, by the Greeks, by the Romans. And there's never a point when they can, well, how about this? The only point that they had was the Passover story that would always bring them back. This story is false. This story is true. Only when we are around the table together, only when we are in relationship with each other, can we be whole. When we're not, well, this is how it goes. Bill and I were beginning to talk about it beforehand because I began to think about how in the history of humanity, the various moments in time when the conflict that arises within communal relationships becomes such a conflict that the community is broken, and in breaking the community life, you see it actually disrupts and destroys the relationships that we have with each other to the point where we begin to not just hate the other person, blame the other person, accuse the other person, but pretty soon it becomes more than just words. It becomes a whole practiced socially, where the struggle against other groups within the community leads to terrible, terrible acts of genocide and violence. On my mind, I've got the story, the conflict between Rwanda and Burundi, if you remember that, quite a number of years ago, where the people in Burundi decided that they were somehow being left out of the benefits that Rwanda was having, and basically went in and obliterated the community in Rwanda. Terrible, terrible genocide. All you have to do, right, is to think of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I was going to say, one of the things I was going to say, Bill, is sometimes you don't even remember what caused the problem, right? It gets lost through the generation. I don't know why we're fighting against each other. I think of Northern Ireland and the fight between, those inclined to Britain and those inclined to Ireland, between the Orange and whoever, the Irish on the other side. Nobody really knew why it was, because somebody defeated somebody in a battle so long ago that nobody even remembers that. And so every year now we've got to enter into this storytelling of the conflict where we fought each other as families. And it finally took two mothers who had lost sons on both sides to finally say, enough already, and began the process, not yet fully resolved, of reconciliation. The brokenness of those communities led to hundreds and hundreds of lives being lost. Just go through the story, right? How many, for whatever reason, the thought that people of color somehow threatened the people who claim to be white and commit atrocities against people of color because somehow, wait a minute, I thought the story was that we don't know who we are unless we are. Well, does it make any difference what a person's skin color is? Does it make any difference what their gender is or their ethnic identity is? Does it really make, well, in this greater narrative, it doesn't make any difference. Because the fundamental core value is I can only be human when I'm in relationship with another human being. And the story of conflict, that's what's interesting. In this narrative, and I checked it, because one of the research things said, well, that in the original Greek text, it says, if your brother has done something against you. Our translation says, if the church, in the church. Well, it's interesting that if that, and I checked the Greek, and the word in Greek is brother. So the text is about that, maybe at the first level that we understand that in the family, in our individual family, that sometimes brothers and sisters and spouses fight to the point where it does break the relationship, and the best might be to get away from each other. But it also suggests that maybe it's only when we work to resolve the conflict between brothers and sisters that we will be full human beings. If we don't try to resolve that conflict, then we're not full human beings. And I know I've told the story before that a great aunt of mine, when I went and visited her, she had broken relationship with her brother and had not talked to him in 40 years because he forgot to pay her back $8. He probably forgot about that. He had no memory of it. She had kept that memory for 40 plus years, and I know she died never resolving that conflict with her brother. We might have similar stories in our families. I found out, going through Ancestry.com, that I had, on my dad's side, an uncle. I had no clue. Nobody in the family ever had mentioned him. And I knew he was an uncle because he had the same mother as my father had, And one of my aunts had signed his death certificate. And come to find out, he was a criminal. He had been shot in a robbery by the police. My family refused to tell that story. I never knew that story. That is a bad story. But imagine that, to break a relationship with a family member and never talk about them again. It's interesting, and at the end of this text today, it says this, it says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. You ever think about that for a moment? Does that mean wherever 2 or 3 who agree, who like each other, who know each other, God is only in the midst of those who agree and like each other? What if in that 2 or 3, one of them is not somebody that you like? Does that mean that God is not going to be present there? It could be. But if we take the greater picture, you see, that in that mix of communal relationships, we have to find a way today, look at the world we live in, we have to find a way to better resolve the conflicts that arise within relationships. I say that because now back to the translation. It says, if anyone in the church, it's probably not a word Jesus would have used. Only Matthew would have used it. How many people walked away from Chalice because they got hurt by either something the pastor said or somebody else said something, and we never see them or hear from them again? Does that matter? Does that matter? Maybe they're never going to tell us that that's what happened. Are we responsible church people then to just let that go and let it pass? What about the people that have been hurt by the church? I tell my nurses, you cannot come on as Jesus saving people in the hospital when the person lying in the bed might have been abused or victimized by a clergy person or another church person. You can't do that. Because that hurt will not get resolved by you talking about Jesus to them. You're in relationship. How do we resolve the conflicts? How do we heal the hurts? How do we bring back mending, making whole the brokenness? That's the powerful work of the church. Because why? When we gather around this table, don't we say that all are welcome? We say that. Do we mean it? Do we really believe it? Enough to make the work that we do about addressing the brokenness and the conflicts within our life, within our community, within the world.